All right, so it is 7:05. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm really excited about this tonight, and I hope everyone here is as well. So hello and welcome. My name is Abby, and I am the tween librarian at the Public Library of Brookline. I'm so glad you could join us for an evening with YA authors Desmond Hall and Christina Hammonds Reid. This author talk is a part of the Public Library of Brookline's Black History Month programming. Along with this, we are also featuring curated book lists on our website featuring Black authors and creators with topics ranging from anything from romance to horror to humor, all sorts. At our Putterham location, we also have a window scavenger hunt for children where we invite them to search around the building to find facts and pictures about famous historical and contemporary Black figures. And on the 27th of this month, just this Saturday, we are hosting a talk with Dolita Cathcart, the Associate Professor of History at Wheaton College, about the famous Brookline resident, Florida Ruffin Ridley, who we've recently changed one of our elementary school names to. Information about this talk can also be found on our website. And before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. This event is held on a Zoom webinar, which means that only the presenters have video and mics. But if anyone has a question for Desmond or Christina, you're very much welcome to use the Q&A function to submit your questions. And at the end of the program, we will be having an audience Q&A. So get excited because we will also be raffling off copies of Desmond and Christina's books. And if you would like to be entered into this raffle, please message me your email address at any point during this program, and you will be entered into that raffle. And I'll put out reminders throughout, so don't miss it yet. And if you'd like to be kept up to date with news from the library, including new programs, services, and updates, I invite you to sign up for our weekly newsletter at brklib.com/newsletter. That's brklib.com/newsletter, and I'll put a link to that in the chat as well. And now let me introduce our speakers for this evening, Desmond Hall with his book, Your Corner Dark, and Christina Hammonds Reid with her book, The Black Kids. I'd also like to introduce our student moderators from 826 Boston, Elisa Mascarenhas and Orianna Dunker.
Hi, so I'm just going to give the bios of all of our great people that we have on the panel today and the students that are going to be interviewing them. So for the students, we have Elisa Mascarenhas, and she uses she, her pronouns, and she is a 9th grade interviewer and writer from the John D. O'Brien High School for Math and Science. And as a published writer for the Rubik's Literary Magazine, she typically writes about social issues, short stories, and her least favorite character, Walter from Raisin in the Sun, in her spare time. Next, we have Orianna Dunker, who is 14 years old and attends Boston Latin School. She was born and raised in Roxbury and is passionate about social justice and improving her community. In her free time, she enjoys listening to music while reading, writing, painting, or drawing. At school, Orianna loves public speaking, math, and using her strengths to be a leader. She would never miss out on an opportunity to learn and is currently improving her acting and roller skating skills. And then I will go on to the wonderful authors that they will be interviewing. So first we have Desmond Hall, who is a Jamaican-born author whose debut YA novel, Your Corner Dark, is a fast-paced thriller that has been described as American Street meets Long Way Down. This searing and gritty novel takes an unflinching look at the harsh realities of gang life in Jamaica and how far a teen is willing to go for family. The book confronts police brutality, colorism, gang culture, and political deception. Desmond graduated Marquette University with a bachelor's in journalism and was selected for the Who's Who of American college students. He has written and directed an HBO feature movie, A Day in Black and White, which was nominated for the Gordon Parks Award. He's also written and directed a full-length stage play, Stockham, Brooklyn, that won the Audience Award at the Downtown Theater Festival at the Cherry Lane Theater. The play was also picked for the Public Theater's New Work series. For 2 years, he worked as a high school biology and English teacher in Brooklyn, New York. In this period of his life, he also counseled teenage ex-cons after their release from Rikers Island Correctional Institution. As an advertising creative director, he has written many TV campaigns, 2 Super Bowl commercials, and won multiple awards while running the creative side of Spike Lee's advertising agency. While working in the advertising and film industry, he has served on the board of the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, the Advertising Council, judged the One Show, Addies, and the New York City Downtown Film Festival. He has also been named one of Variety magazine's top 50 creatives to watch. And next, we have Christina Hammonds Reid. And she is the New York Times bestselling author of The Black Kids, a William C. Morris YA Debut Award finalist. She holds an MFA from the University of Southern California's School of Cinematic Arts. Her writing has appeared in Elle, Teen Vogue, the Santa Monica Review, and One Teen Story, among other outlets. A native of the Los Angeles area, she is a proud Angelino, and self-proclaimed beach bum. And yes.
Awesome. Okay, so I think at this point I'll kick it off by, and thanks for the introduction, and thanks to the Brookline Public Library. Much appreciated for this opportunity to be here tonight for Black History Month, and a lot of love for 826 Boston and the great work you guys do with everyone, and so much appreciated, and thank you. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the very beginning of my debut novel, Your Corner Dark. And my protagonist, Frankie, as you'll see, he's waiting to hear about a scholarship and whether he gets into a particular university or not with that scholarship. I think a situation a lot of you can relate to or will relate to very soon. So Frankie put down his empty water bucket on the side of the steep mountainside road that was just wide enough for a sedan and 2 well-fed goats. The sun had only just started to warm, too early for the post office to be open. Still, Frankie gazed at the ramshackle building. His scholarship letter could be inside. It was nearly all he thought about these days. If it came, if it brought good news, he soon would be headed off to study in America. Jamaica was so bankrupt, it could hardly afford hope. But hope was Frankie's light, and he shined it often. In the distance lay miles of lush green forest and fields, and beyond that, the capital city of Kingston. A handful of 20-story structures sat in the center of the skyline. Near the Olympic Stadium, where he'd once seen the Jamaican sprinters practice relays, stood the University of West Indies campus. Frankie knew he could get into their engineering program, but all a Jamaican diploma guaranteed was debt. Jobs for young people were just too hard to find. Gnats circled his head. He stuck a forefinger in the corner of his eye and removed a dead one. He studied it. His own career might be as short-lived, even if he got a chance to study at the University of Arizona. A classmate's older brother had recently come back from America. He hadn't been able to secure work, even though he had a master's degree in engineering. No way was Frankie going to let that happen. He flicked the gnat away. Then, the rev of an engine broke the early morning quiet. A black Toyota barreled down the mountain towards him. A thumping bass and pulsating rhythm rippled through the humid air. Sizzler's raspy voice and reggae lyrics flowing from the car stereo. His Uncle Joe's long, sinewy arm emerged from the window of the shotgun seat. In his hand, a Glock revolving in a slow, tight circle like a predator stalking prey. Frankie smiled and pulled it back to a smirk. His uncle always kept a round in the chamber. Pulling the slide took time, and time was what you didn't have when things got ugly. Uncle Joe had his finger on the trigger, and the road had a lot of potholes. A step to the right or the left to get out of range would have been the smart thing to do, because accidents happen. But Frankie held his ground. The Toyota rolled to a stop in front of Frankie. Pop, 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 his uncle shouted, his thick brown dreads making his angular face look even more so. He lowered his gun and extended his fist. Frankie bumped it with his own, catching a whiff of weed so skunky it had to be good. Uncle Joe's red eyes confirmed it. Icebox was at the wheel, engulfing the driver's side with his massive frame. He was one of Joe's enforcers. His other, Buck Buck, sat in the back seat talking on his cell phone. "Wagwan, nephew?" Joe asked. "You hear about scholarship?" Frankie couldn't go anywhere without being asked that question. "Not yet, Uncle." Joe pulled back his locks, gazing at him. "If you get it, you're going to run away from Jamdo. You're going to leave your people." Joe was still smiling, but his words felt like a slap. "I'm not going to run away, Uncle." Joe held up a hand for Frankie to wait as his phone buzzed. He searched his pockets, pulled out a flip phone and a black phone. He answered the black phone. The flip phone was prepaid, Frankie knew, and nothing that tied his uncle's name to it. And the black phone had special encryption in case he had to send a message. Like Joe had just sent a message with his diss. "You're going to run away from Jamdo." Sure, Frankie wanted to leave Jamaica for the job opportunities in America. All his friends did. Jamaica was like a messed up parent. You loved it, but at the same time you wanted to leave it. You said bad things about it, but you'd get mad if anyone else said anything bad about it. Frankie wanted to explain that. He paced while his uncle barked at whoever was on the other line. Finally, Joe clicked off the phone. "Yes, nephew." "I'm not running away, Uncle," Frankie said again. "Once I set myself over in foreign, I'm going to come back and do some big things for Jamaica." Big things, eh? Joe nodded slowly. "Ambition is important, but just not forget, is here you're born, and is here you for spread your roots. And you must watch out for Babylon. It's even bigger in America than Jamdo." Frankie nodded back slowly. For his uncle and all Rastafarians, Babylon meant corruption in the government and police forces. Joe loved to rail against Babylon as much as he loved to smoke ganja. So that's a little bit from the first chapter. And I think we have the amazing Christina Hammonds about to read from the Black Kids.
I was going to say, I love actually hearing that in your voice. It's so cool to hear the passage in your voice, right?
Yeah, well, it's funny. My family always calls me Stush, which
Really?
which is like Jamaican for, being stuck up, because the language, we come from the country, and it's like a kind of thick patois, and I had to dial it back a lot because I noticed my beta readers didn't know what the heck I was writing about. Yeah.
Oh man.
So it is.
Well, I guess it's a good thing to be understood, right? Like you want to make sure.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to read from chapter 5, which is, I think, a pretty good snapshot of what the Black Kids is about. It's right as the riots are about to begin. So for those of you who don't know, the Black Kids is a coming of age story that takes place against the backdrop of the 1992 LA riots. And with that, I will begin. Lucia and I stand in line at Western Union behind a balding Russian man with really long ear hair like my old piano teacher. Save for the television in the corner, it's quiet, eerily so, and I try to keep my feet perfectly still so my sneakers won't squeak on linoleum. Sometimes, when I have to pee really badly or when I can't make a sound, I pretend that I'm a runaway slave and I have to be very still or else I'll be discovered. It's fucked up, but it works. Usually, this place is a swirl of tongues and transactions, like waiting at the airport, but without any of the excitement of going somewhere. There's always some baby fussing while some mom screams, "Get down from there," at some kid, which sounds pretty much the same in any language. Today, it's just me, Lucia, and the bald man. Together we watch as a crowd pulls a white man from his truck and begins to beat the shit out of him. His long blonde hair swings from side to side as he staggers, disoriented with each blow. In a different world, he'd be a lead guitarist rocking out, not a broken construction worker tumbling. A man flashes gang signs at the helicopters hovering above. They're not even 10 miles away, but it might as well be a whole different country. They're my fancy school and my fancy neighborhood, and then there's this. The television flickers in fragments across the Russian's head as he shakes it. He turns to look at me angrily. See? He says. Lucia places her body between the two of us. No hablar con él, she says. The man returns to the screen. Lucia speaks to me in Spanish when she doesn't want white people to easily understand what we're talking about. She taught me when I was younger, and then as soon as we got a chance to study languages in school, I chose Spanish. And anyway, it's LA. If you even have paid attention to the city around you, you'll learn it by osmosis. It's not like it's a secret language, but it's easier for her and easy enough for me. I'm sure to everyone looking at us, we're an odd pair, a lanky black teenager and a tiny Guatemalan always together. Lucia's favorite cashier is Jose. If he's working, everything goes smoothly, and they joke and laugh in Spanish about how he's going to marry her. When she's done, she kisses her fingertips and places them on the envelope before sliding it across the counter, where Jose converts it to a textbook for Umberto, guitar lessons for Roberto. Today, Jose isn't in a joking mood. El mundo en que vivimos, Jose sighs. His eyes are fixed on the television screen, where the news shows images of a man slamming a slab of concrete down on the truck driver's head. See, Lucia says. Jose's hair is the dark of an oil slick at night. He's younger than Lucia, Mexican, not Guatemalan. He lives with his cousin and abuelita in a small house in Highland Park with 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. And if you climb up on his roof, you can see the city on a clear day. He sounded like a real estate agent when he told this to Lucia. I'm going to own my own business, he said last week, a declaration of intent. Doing what, she said. He wants to own one of those places downtown where they sell Cubias San Marcos and clothing and keychains and Coca-Cola in glass bottles. The San Marcos blankets are super plush and have different designs on them, like cute kittens and majestic lions and strawberry shortcake and the Dodgers. A few weeks ago, Lucia took me downtown and had me pick one out. The air downtown is always the color of a nasty loogie, but I like the buildings because they've got character, which is also why I love the blankets. The one I chose had a white tiger on it, lounging like a queen. You take it with you when you go to college, Lucia said. And it was like she was preparing us both for goodbye. I wish I could take you with me to college, I joked, and we laughed. But then I felt kind of bad because it made it seem like Lucia was my personal servant. When I was younger and had a nightmare, I would walk downstairs to Lucia's room and crawl into bed with her, and she would tell me stories about her boys and her country and the handsome but very bad man double she divorced before she ran to the United States. He did unforgivable things, she said, for what he thought were the right reasons. She used to think so too until she didn't. And so he became the villain in my bedtime stories. Tell me about Arturo who lives in the house by the bridge, I'd say. Jose is not like Arturo, I say to Lucia. Jose is a good man. What's a good man, Lucia sighs. They're all good until they're not. But I see the way she looks at him, like maybe she'd like to sell cobillas and clothing and knickknacks and Coke and glass bottles with him. Like maybe she could sit up on his roof, cuddle up in a blanket and watch the fireworks over Dodger Stadium. I can see her dreaming up their life together and deciding maybe they could be good. I wonder if she's going to tell him today that she's leaving soon. Although I try not to watch, my gaze finds its way back to the television screen. The truck driver lies on the ground in a halo of his own blood and hair. Nobody goes to help him. The police are nowhere to be found. Some man walks up, takes the wallet right from the truck driver's pocket and runs off. Finally, the truck driver gets to his knees and another man comes up almost out of nowhere and appears to kick him in the head. I feel myself wince. Go out with me, Jose says to Lucia. It's the first time he said it for real and not just as a joke. On the television, the man drags himself into his truck and tries to drive away. The people at the intersection continue to throw anger at passing cars. From up above, it looks like somewhere I've driven through 1,000 times, but also somewhere I've never been. I bet my dad would know where it is. Okay, Lucia says softly to Jose. And I look over at her because she's going home to Guatemala, and what's even the point of going on a date when you're going to leave? But maybe that bloody truck driver made her forget. Or maybe he reminded her why she left. Or maybe being around Jose makes her think she might want to stick around just a little bit longer. Jose completes the rest of the transaction in silence. On our way home, as we cross the street, Lucia reaches for my hand like she used to when I was little. And even though I haven't done so in a long time, I hold it. By the time we get home, the city is burning. The buildings are stripped bare and people yank the guts through their skeletons. Lucia hands me a small envelope. The cats have said it was accidentally delivered to them and they kept forgetting to bring it over. You open it, I say. My heart feels like it's going to fall right out my chest and splat on the kitchen floor. It's your future, mija. The envelope says my future's been waitlisted. I want to cry. I'm in at other schools, really good schools even. But Stanford's the school I want, close to home but far enough away to be some other me. Somewhere I can briefly stop being a sister and a daughter, but only an hour's flight away in case Jo needs me. I don't know for what exactly. Maybe in case her broken brain delivers a rough uppercut and she needs me to pull her up, squirt some water in her mouth, ice her bruises, and tell her to keep fighting. I need to be somewhere I can still feel the ocean, my ocean, in my hair and skin. I'm convinced Stanford is the only place I'll thrive. I want to throw up. I want to disappear. I want to crawl into a hole with embarrassment. I feel all of these things and burned up in their atmosphere as I hurtle down. Lucia pats me on the thigh. Everything will work out all right. Instead of crying, I watch. Up goes a shoe store. Up goes a laundromat. Up goes a TV repair store. Up goes a mattress store. Up goes a liquor store. All of it goes up. My mother calls me from her car phone. It's going to be a while. I'm going to try and take the 101 to the 405 and see if that's better. I'm afraid to get on the 10. My father calls me from his car phone. I'm okay. I'll get there when I get there. It's bad, really bad. Stay home, okay? Promise you won't try to go out with your friends. Not tonight. I promise. I call Jo from our living room. The phone rings and rings, and I'm afraid she's not there, but she is. Are you okay? I ask. Of course I'm not. It's so wrong. I'm so tired of this shit. They had the goddamn evidence right in front of their faces. It was right there, Ashley. I mean, they don't even fucking see us, even when they're looking right at us. Usually, when Jo goes on about one of her causes, it feels so far away, like she's angry because she knows she should be and not because she actually feels that shit in her kidneys. But this feels different. Even I feel it somewhere in my innards pulsing. You should come home, I say, until everything's blown over. I'm not leaving Harrison here alone, she says. Stupid Harrison. Just because he maybe survived tetanus doesn't mean he can save her from everything else. Just bring him here with you. I'm not subjecting him to mom again after what happened at dinner. Is it him you're really concerned about, or you, I say? She doesn't respond. Jo, don't do anything stupid, please. I think of her handcuffed to her high school flagpole, fighting for brown people halfway across the world. She spent her suspension calling our local congressperson. Jo's the kind of person who would accidentally find herself in the middle of somebody else's riot. Dude, what the hell, Ash? The phone clicks, and then my sister's gone. And that's chapter 5.
Great. So I think at this point, Elisa and Orianna, I believe you take over the show and take us through a Q&A period.
That is correct. Orianna, you want to start off?
Sure. So I have a question for both of the authors. So in your books, you mention colorism, classism, racism, mental health, to gang violence and just violence in general, sexism, toxic masculinity, and so many more. So what was the most difficult part about writing about these issues, and why did you choose to incorporate all of them into your stories?
Okay, I think a great question, by the way. I think I wrote a lot about a lot of what you just mentioned because I think it tells, it fills in the tapestry of Jamaica, those issues of colorism, toxic masculinity, et cetera, they are rampant. And I think they are part of telling the story of Jamaica. A lot of times, and I think it's maybe a good moment to mention sort of the process that I go through a lot when I start writing is I use the forces of antagonism, which is a convention that the great story guru Robert McKee coined, where you surround your character with as many negative forces as you can. And when I think about telling the story of Jamaica and Frankie's story, I tried to surround him with people who could be obstacles social issues that could be obstacles, his inner demons, because, certainly that's almost always some of the best stuff in stories, and then geography, climate, etc. And by surrounding him with all of that, those issues you mentioned came into play. And I think one of the difficult things of writing about it all is using imagination and research and not necessarily relying on the research completely. Because when you write something that's absolutely true, doesn't mean it's going to be interesting. You have to really dramatize it in order to have it resonate in fiction to have a certain effect. So I think those were kind of the reasons why for me.
I think that's a pretty good, I'm going to use the phrase you used. Oh my goodness, I'm having a brain fart in the middle of my answer. Rewind.
Yeah.
I would say that intersectionality is at the heart of what I write, because we lead intersectional lives, right? Like if I were to write honestly about anybody's experience, it's going to be informed by your race, it's going to be informed by your class, it's going to be informed by your gender identity, it's going to be informed by your sexuality. And so for me, it was important to explore all of those things. And in terms of Ashley, my protagonist, she's a wealthy Black cis girl, and in a very specific era of a moment of racial reckoning. So it didn't, the entire genesis for me of this idea is, what is it like to be one of the token Black kids at this moment of racial reckoning, and in one of these very wealthy spaces where you can feel disconnected from what's happening in South LA. So for me, class was very much a part of it. And I think also because in writing honestly about LA, like Desmond was saying about Jamaica, you want to make sure that you are being honest to the fabric of the place. And when people talk about LA, I think very often they think of either the glamour and like the Kardashian lifestyle, or they think about like South LA and they assume that everybody there is in gangs or whatever the case may be. And those are not the city that I live in. That's not the reality. The reality is that we have so many different kinds of people. We have so many people from all over the place. And even when I was telling people that I was writing a coming of age story about the 1992 LA riots, everyone had a story that they wanted to share. So like a rich white lady told me how she was driving her BMW home through South LA and she was so scared. And a Guatemalan immigrant told me how he had just landed in LA and was like, what did I get myself into? And there are people I know who were kids at the time who were having to be rushed indoors by neighbors because they were endangered. So for me, I wanted to capture that. And I think that that's what's most honest, when you can do something where you're showing the city in its true light and not just funneling it through stereotypes.
It's actually very interesting to go off to try to like fill in the entire story actually. But another question that I have is, with a story that you're trying to write and you're trying to fill in so many like blank spaces with the current narrative, when do you know when you're done editing? Like you've written the story, but how do you know when you're actually truly finished with it?
Yeah, we're never done.
Yeah.
It's never over. And I think one of the important things to talk to or address in terms of your question is having a writing community. And I think when you have writers that you trust to share your work with, it really, really helps the process. I mean, writing is one of the loneliest businesses you could get into. So having the community helps in that respect. But as far as editing, to address your question, when you have a writing community, you don't feel so paranoid about sharing your mediocrity. You know, when your writing is not finished and you know it's not finished, you don't really want to give it to too many people, because one, they may be pretty harsh with you. Two, they may not understand what you're trying to do. Three, they may not give you ideas to forward your work. And four, they can be negative sometimes. But when you have a writing community, they understand your process. They understand the writing process itself. And they may be able to give you notes, insights, thoughts, share things that they've heard from, other writers. For example, I went on a walk last Saturday with a friend who is a writer, and he just passed something on that really helped me click through on a story that I was working on. And it wasn't even anything about the actual story. His advice was great, but he just talked about something else that made me go, I get it. So I'd say having that writing community will really help you get your editing together. And they may be able to tell you and say, you know what? I think you're ready to go out with your story into the world.
And I would say writing is rewriting, is rewriting, is rewriting. And I feel like there are still people I know who, when they see their books, if they read them, they're like, maybe I wouldn't have written that way now. Or when I read things that I wrote when I was younger, I'm like, I would have completely changed how that happened there. So I think you never honestly feel like your editing's done. Like, you are always going to feel like there's something I could tweak. And sometimes the heart of it is not being too precious with your material, but by which I mean not feeling like everything has to be perfect before you share it with the world. Because even if you don't feel, I feel like there's some element of feeling things in your gut, right? Like at some point you do feel like this is what this is right now. But even if it goes out into the world and there's maybe a little something where you're like, I don't know that I quite got that right, somebody's going to take something from it and they're going to experience it in this way. And I think that the act of sharing it is just as important as the act of writing it. I think sometimes as writers, we can write things and then we're just like, I'm just going to keep this in my notebook because it's not good. But we don't acknowledge that, like, the sharing of the writing is part of what's beautiful about the writing process itself.
So I have another question, and it's for the both of you again. So you guys are both writing about young people in your books. So did you reflect parts of yourself as teenagers into your characters, and did that influence the way you told the story?
I think as writers, we reveal ourselves in our work. No matter what we do, we reveal something about ourselves. Many times writing is, dangerous because you reveal a lot about yourself and you make yourself very vulnerable. And many times that vulnerability is the best stuff. I think in my process, I created an amalgam with the characters. I thought about, I knew people in Jamaica in various businesses and pursuits, young people, as well as the older characters. And I used parts of people, but I used a lot of invention as well in order to tell the story. And I think, like I was saying earlier, I think when you're trying to thematically tell something, finding a way to make the characters resonate by putting them in successively more difficult situations to strip away their characterization and show you their real character. That's kind of what I go for when I'm doing that.
And I would say I did and I didn't. Like, Ashley is not me at all. I was a very different teenager than Ashley was, but at the root of it, some of our struggles are the same. Like, I struggled with being one of the few Black kids in more privileged settings more often than not. Or what is it like to be one of the token Black kids in this school? What does it mean when people assume that if you're in a store, you don't belong in that particular store? Like, all of those aspects of what it's like to grow up in a particular community and in LA specifically, those I culled for. And I think, like Desmond was saying, you always want to include some piece of yourself, even if you can't control that you're doing so. There's always something in there because it's coming from you. So, and I think that's important as much for your protagonist as it is for your antagonist, right? Like, it's really easy to write an evil character who's just one dimensional, blah, blah, blah. But if we are writing in a way that is most vulnerable and most interesting, our antagonist should be just as interesting as our protagonist. There's this phrase I've heard where your protagonist, or I'm sorry, your antagonist is the protagonist of his or her own story or their story. So this idea that like, oh, that's like the mean girl. Well, why is she the mean girl? What's happened to her? Like what's going on in her life that's making her act out in that way? So sometimes we take that from personal stuff. Sometimes we take that from people we know. So all of it stems from, I think, just humanity. And hopefully as writers, we're often observing other people too, right? And trying to empathize as much as we can with other people.
Thank you. That's a very, very detailed answer. My next question that I have is, do you have any advice regarding like world building? Since you mentioned trying to avoid one-dimensional characters and including a bit of yourself when you're writing, would you consider like parts of your environment in there as well?
Yeah, I think first thing I would say that I love and I don't always do is smell. You know, there's so many times we forget in our world building to include the smell. I went through, I actually watched a video with my oldest daughter, and they had these food tasting experts, and they blindfolded them, and they put these various dishes in front of them, and they were able to identify them almost all the time. But when they put the nose clip on them and these experts couldn't smell the food, they were like as bad as we are in determining, you know, what the food was. And I think smell is very important. You know, Proust writes about this in many of his works. And I think a lot of times using a sense of smell as we build the world to actually consciously think about, I don't know, every page or so, you know, just as an exercise to sort of try to remember to incorporate what is the character smelling. You know, it gives us all a very visceral reaction. And I think that can be really helpful. And there's one other thing too, and you know, Christina and I both come from a film background. And one of the things in the film world is that is done a lot in world building is to create an image system. And with an image system, you take the theme of your story. So, for example, it's a prison movie. Let's say it's Shawshank Redemption, or it's Casablanca, or something where people are trapped. And you think of what can I put in the environment that sort of subconsciously plays to being trapped. And you do this throughout your story. You take each of your chapters and think about how you could put maybe one or two things in just as an exercise. But I think it helps with world building a whole lot to be able to deal with those, you know, different ways of looking at by having that image system. And it can really help, you know, maybe it's water, you know, because it means rebirth. If it's a movie about separation, a couple breaking up, maybe it's obstacles. But thinking of an image system can help. I mean, of course, we have the obvious ways of, you know, just painting the picture of the environment. But I think those two ways of smell and image systems could be helpful.
And I would say, coming once again, sort of echoing Desmond as far as a film background, when you think about when you see a play, or if you're videoing a play, because that's kind of what film can be, you want to think, what are the characters wearing? What does their hair look like? Smell? What does the ground underneath them feel like? Like, are they on hard ground? Are they on concrete? What are they listening to? So like with the movie, you always are thinking of like score, like, is there something in the background, or is it completely quiet, or is it something that's in her headphones? And so for me, it's just thinking of all the different sounds and tastes and smells, but also making sure that you're paying attention to all of your characters and not just your main character, because that's part of the world building. If only your main character feels interesting, then you're not creating an entire world around him or her. So you want to make sure that you're doing all of that for all of your characters throughout the entire book, and that your setting is also, in a way, its own character, right? Like, I think when people really fall in love with fantasy books, it's because a lot of fantasy writers are very good about creating a world that you invest in as much as the characters, and sometimes more so depending on the fantasy writer. So I think it's just about attention to detail as much as possible throughout.
Thank you. So I'm seeing that it's 7:45. Do we have more time for questions? Yeah, okay. So I have a question for Desmond. So in your story, you capture the full essence and complexity of Jamaica. So you touch on the negative parts, positive parts, and the parts of Jamaica the world doesn't get to see. So what was that process like, and why did you want to share these perspectives, even if they were negative, about the country through Frankie's story?
Yeah, I think it's important to see the depth of a country and the depth of a people, because many times Jamaicans or, African Americans are thought of as one monolithic group. And in order to do that, you have to show the good, the bad, the indifferent, and all sides of, a person's life, and to understand the reasons of why they get to where they are. I think a lot of times I've listened to friends who have gone to Jamaica, and from that van ride from the airport to getting behind the walls at the resort, they look out and they see this world, and they have inklings of things that are going on. And a lot of times there's not exactly a proper interpretation of it. And I think in my way, I sort of dimensionalize that with Your Corner Dark. I, speak about the political situation and the good as well as the bad. Speaking about, so-called poverty and the middle class and the upper class. And I think it's really important that Frankie, my protagonist, is extremely intelligent. He's a kid that doesn't come from great means, but boy, he could do AP calculus really well. And seeing that entire pastiche is really important. And that's sort of one of the reasons why I wanted to show the entirety of Jamaica. And I don't think I actually showed the entirety. That's what my next book will attempt to do more of. But again, we're not one monolithic group.
Yeah, thank you.
I believe that is all the time we have for questions from students. But Desmond, I hear that we have an activity.
Yes. Christina and I are going to take you through an activity, because we mentioned earlier the forces of antagonism. And as Christina mentioned, your protagonist is only as interesting, maybe your story is only as interesting as your villain. Maybe the success of your story is actually in the villainous side of the story, because it gives your protagonist something to fight against. So when you have the forces of antagonism, right? These are sort of 5 or so different ways of surrounding your protagonist, and maybe other characters as well, with as many obstacles as you can. They can then venture forward in the world in an interesting way in the book that really captivates the readers. So one force of antagonism, of course, is the people, right? What is that obstruction? It can be the inner demons, and the interiority is very important with, the forces, as well as geography. It can also be climate, and maybe it's the social mores. So with that in mind, Christina and I would like both Elisa and Orianna to choose a significant African American character and explain how you might, or explain how that character might be surrounded with forces of antagonism.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just use Marsha P. Johnson as an example. So she was a LGBT activist, a self-identified drag queen, and was an advocate for gay rights. But force of antagonism, I must say, during that time, she was born in 1945. She must have faced racism, obviously transphobia, and there were mental antagonisms because of depression, um, dysphoria, possibly. And there are societal issues within like racism, transphobia, homophobia, things of that sort. Because during that time, even after she was murdered, the police didn't actually provide much detail or much help, mainly because she was a black trans woman. So there's our societal factors at work, but there's also mental factors as well.
Yeah. And the figure I'll choose is Baird Rustin, who was a logistics coordinator for a lot of civil rights movements. He's not spoke about a lot today because in the civil rights movement, he was openly a former leftist with his political views, and he was also openly gay. So he faced a lot of homophobia in the civil rights movement. And one of the forces of antagonism he faced was, one, the justice system. For organizing one of the freedom rides, he was in a chain gang in jail for 22 days. And he was in multiple times he was incarcerated for joining the civil rights movement and playing a role in that. And he's even organized boycotts from inside of jail. So that must have been a really strong force in his life, which definitely stopped him from doing all the things in his career that he wanted to do. And it was unjust. It's ironic because it's the justice system.
Great. Yeah, so those are excellent, really, really great. So many times when you're starting off in your story and you want to make sure your character doesn't come across as like flat, not dimensional, and you want to make them more interesting, it's a great exercise to write your character's name in the middle of the page or screen, write down what their physical want is, what their internal want is, and then sort of surround them with forces of antagonism. For example, if the want is money, what person stops the person? What social mores of that time, stops the person from getting money? What, in what geography? Is the money far away? And by putting those ideas on the page, it really helps you formulate what your character can go up against. And as Christina mentioned earlier, the more interesting your villain, the more interesting your story. So I think, Abby, you were going to do some Q&A at this point?
Yeah. So if anybody has any questions for Desmond or Christina, please submit them using the Q&A. But I know some of our other panelists might have some questions for them as well, and I know I do. So I love hearing about the sorts of research that authors do whenever they're writing about either a place, where they don't live, or a place that's not as familiar to them, or even a different time period. I love hearing about the types of research that people do when they're writing a historical fiction novel. So I was just wondering if either of you had like a fun thing that you learned, or just like a really great source that you found, or just like a favorite piece of research you had.
So my book was pretty heavy on research just because I wasn't Ashley's age at the time of the riots at all. I did a lot, and also just because I think it was important to get more of a feel for where we were in 1992. Like, as much as you can write, and I think there's what's universal about being young at a certain age, you also want to make sure you're getting something very specific to her experience in 1992. So I did a lot of research, and some of that involved just watching YouTube. Some of it was watching music videos. It was watching news reels, actually, like news I can't think of words right now, but news sources, because you want to get a sense for how things were covered, right? Like I think in 2020, we saw how the George Floyd protests were covered and how that morphed over a period of time. And so there was a very similar thing happening in 1992 in terms of how the protests were covered. It was very heavily focused on the looting and the violence, which was obviously true, but there wasn't the focus on the people who were doing the work of healing or why that destruction of property was happening. There was still the prioritization of property over personhood and why people would feel the need to uprise in the first place. So YouTube randomly was very good. And there are several books that I have here that I'm going to show you without going into all of them. This one's super cool if anybody's interested in the time period. It's actually from the LA Times, and it has a comprehensive bunch of articles leading up to and after the riots. This one is a one-woman play by Anna Devere Smith, who, if any of you guys watch Blackish, she plays Rainbow's mom, but she's an incredible playwright. And she performed this as a one-woman show. And I think I read, or somebody told me earlier today, you can actually find her one-woman play on PBS. It's worth watching. And then this one was about a radio station that was one of the ways in which people came together. So like now we have Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat and blah, blah, blah. But back then radio was a way for people to communicate with each other, whether it was their positive feelings about the riot or the negative feelings about the riot. Just sort of, it was a forum for people to vent. And it was really interesting hearing how radio, and specifically this Black-owned radio station, was a way for the community to communicate in the middle of all of that. So I love research. I could go on and on and on about research, but I think that's one of the cool things about historical fiction is you just get to live in a different era too. Although I do take a slight offense to the fact that the 90s is historical fiction.
Me too. Yeah, for me, just briefly, I mean, Christina said, I say everything she said. That was really well said. And in my process, I spent a good amount of time on the CIA's website. I knew a lot about the other side of things from people I know in Jamaica, but there were other details and there were alerts that would be on the website that I would look at many times that would give incredible background information. And a lot of it, I didn't use, but it really let me understand the greater complexities of the drug trade. And, it really helped me inform the story that way.
Great. That's one of my favorite things hearing authors talk about is the research they do, because their eyes always light up and they're like, oh my God, I have to tell you about all these things that I learned. So thank you guys for sharing. I see that Heather also has a question that she put in the chat, wanting to know about the role of music in your books and also the role that music played in your lives as teens.
Wow. So in Jamaica is, so very well known for reggae. And one of the big things in the book that I think reggae aficionados and people back home would really get is that, for example, Joe is a very conflicted person. He's a Rastafarian as well as a drug dealer. And Rastas are generally people of peace. But he feels he has to become a Don in order to help his community. One of the things he helps, achieve in the story for the community is that he has garbage picked up. And that's actually from some of the research I did. A lot of the Dons in Jamaica fill in the social voids that the government can't, because Jamaica is in a great deal of debt. And he listens to Sizzla mostly, and Sizzla plays several times in the book. And, very poignantly, he plays at the end as well. And what Sizzla does is he speaks about conscious lyrics. And conscious lyrics in Jamaica are about roots, culture. It's more Bob Marley, about the soul and the emotionality of life. Whereas, there are songs that convey slackness. And slackness is a way of talking about, violence, and just bad things being done. And there are certain artists mentioned throughout the book that convey those two sides of that coin, you know, the roots and conscious side and the slackness part. And I weave that in, and it really helped me to tell the characters, you know, it reminds me of who they are, you know, to keep the theme proper for each particular character.
And I would say my book is pretty wall-to-wall music. It is very music heavy because I love music, but I also think that when you're young, that is when you are most invested in what's new. You are so taking in every single song that comes in, and you have opinions on everything. Even if you don't like it, you're just like, that's a crappy song, that's a great song. But also I think it's when you're most open to new things. So for me, music helps set their age as much as their character, and each character has a different soundscape. Like throughout my book, certain people are listening to more punk, or like Lana is one of the characters in my book. She's rocking out to Hole and Bikini Kill, and Ashley and her friends are listening to poppier R&B, but then the boys are trying to listen to hip hop, and it's not from an organic place. It's because they're kind of posers, and they are white boys of privilege who are trying to posture like they are somehow harder than they are. So throughout the book, and Ashley's father has 70s funk is kind of what he's listening to. And Ashley's sister Jo is all over the place with her music taste, and that's probably more like me. So all of these characters have their soundscapes that help us understand where they are throughout the text emotionally, and also just where we are in terms of the action throughout. So I kind of think, and because of my film background, I think about, if this scene is building, what is the sound that we're listening to? What is the music that we're playing? Like, are we listening to hip hop as we're driving through the city, or are we listening to like super poppy music and these girls are just sort of being young and having fun? So music is to me, it's really important, especially I think in YA, because it's when it's most important to us in ways. And like at any point when you're young, if somebody mentions a song that you listen to when you're young, like even now, I'm not as young as I once was, but if I hear a song from when I was 10, I know all the lyrics to it, even if I didn't like the song. So I think that it's really important to like capture what that feels like on the page.
Hey, thanks, guys. If we don't have any other questions, I think that's going to be it for the night. We are running about 2 minutes over our time. I just want to say thank you guys so much to Desmond and Christina, and also our student moderators who did such a fantastic job. Yes, claps all around. Thank you everyone for such a lovely evening and enjoying it with us tonight. And if you did want a chance to win some copies of those books, please send me your email address and a private message. I'll get you entered into that raffle, and look for that probably early next week. So again, thank you guys, and I just hope everyone has a lovely evening. Awesome.
Thank you guys for your time and for putting all this together. And Orianna and Alyssa, you guys rock. And Charlene.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night,
It was so great interviewing you guys.
Thank you. You guys were so thoughtful.